Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So on this show, we've talked a lot about, well, I guess in bits and pieces, we've kind of talked about Homelabs. And I kind of wanted to take pretty much an entire episode here and just kind of really dive into the concept of a home lab. What is it? What you should have in it, and crucially, why software developers should have one, and honestly, why everyone should have one. Now, obviously, we can't, as you'll see as we get into this episode, we can't go insanely deep, because if we covered every single branch and tree and explored every single avenue of home labs, let's just say this episode would be like a week or month long. Like it would be really long. Like there's not enough time to go down every single branch and avenue, as you will see. But speaking of home labs, I guess to talk about my home lab, in the glorious segment of what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So listeners of the Dark Assassins podcast are well aware of the Xserve saga that's been going on with me. Now, apparently, I am dumb because if you recall back to when I talked about how I managed to get the Lights Out management port working, I said you had to install macOS Lion on a separate drive and you couldn't dual boot. Yeah, that's not true. You can totally dual boot. I'm just dumb and didn't realize that I had my Xserve locked at the time, so I couldn't actually boot into anything else. And then the reason why I happened to have it unlocked was when I took it out of the rack, unlocked it so I could switch the drive out. So you definitely can dual boot it, and that would be my recommendation. So it was kind of funny that I just kind of accidentally realized this, because the reason that I accidentally realized it was I wasn't even trying to figure out how to dual boot. What I was trying to do was trying to see if I could get macOS 10 Lion in a VM to try to see if I could maybe, figure out a way to manage the Lights Out management port there through that, which that kind of failed, which I'm not too surprised, and I gave up on that because I had to, because you're running on a VM on top of macOS, so you're using a Type 2 hypervisor, which basically means that you're running on top of an operating system and you don't have access to the system hardware. So just kind of going off that, I figured it was a long shot anyway that there'd even be a chance that it could access the Lights Out management port. And then after hours and hours of trying, I just gave up because it just wasn't working. Because as we've mentioned before on the Dark Assassins podcast, macOS does not like to be virtualized. It does not play nice at all. But in the process of doing this VM shenanigans, one thing I tried to do was insert my macOS 10 Lion installer CD into the Xserve, and macOS Monterey did not detect that a CD was put in. And because it didn't detect that a CD was put in at all, it was not able to eject said CD. So the CD was stuck in the CD drive and I had no way to get it out. So I tried, a bunch of different things. And at this point, I had the Xserve unlocked. I don't remember exactly why I had it unlocked, but I had it unlocked. And I went into the reboot process and then realized I could actually boot into the CD. And I was like, okay, well, let's just do this. And then, that led me down the rabbit hole of just, dual booting so I could have Lion. So this way I don't have to, every time I want to boot into Lion, I don't have to, pull the Xserve out of the rack, take the cover off, swap the drive out, and then do all that shenanigans. Now, you might be wondering why the Xserve has a lock on it, which this is actually a pretty common thing on servers. I have 2 Dell servers also that have like a front bezel thing that kind of clips onto the front, and both of those have locks on them too. And the reason why this makes sense and why servers would have something like this is because virtually every server out there has the capacity to hold multiple hard drives and generally has some kind of like hardware RAID controller on board. And if it's not using specifically that hardware RAID controller, it's probably using a software RAID controller, like ZFS, for example. Using a RAID like through ZFS, or I think Windows has the ability to do RAID also. Mac OS has the ability to do it. But generally there's some kind of RAID involved, because if you have, say, like, on big storage servers, for example, you have like 12 drives populated, you're not going to individually have all those drives, linked into the operating system, most likely. Unless for some reason you, I guess, wanted to, I guess theoretically you could have it virtualized and like each VM got its own like separate drive or whatever. But regardless, because all these drives are literally in the front and they're hot swappable, so you can just like insert them, take them in and out without actually having to disassemble the server at all. Like on a normal computer, you'd have to like either take the back off the laptop or take the side panel off the desktop to actually get into the components and remove the hard drives. On not all, but a lot of servers, you can just pull the drives out from the front of it. Anyway, the point of the locking mechanism is basically to prevent you from being able to do any of that kind of stuff. Because if you think about it, if your server's running and you pull a drive out, I guess best case scenario is your system crashes because the drive got removed. Worst case scenario is you completely mess up your RAID array and have all kinds of data corruption and possible data loss. If you're using a RAID 0, oh man, your data is gone. So don't do that. So that's basically why locks are on servers. But the other thing that the Xserve lock does is, because it's like an actual like lock you can twist rather than just like a bezel lock that clips on so you can't remove the bezel. The lock on the Xserve actually locks down like the USB ports, so you can't like hold down Option to like boot into another drive mechanism, which is why I thought you couldn't dual boot in the first place, because it was locked, and I completely forgot about that. But yeah, so that was fun. But also, speaking of the Xserve, you'll recall that I was trying to figure out a way to use IPMI through the Lights Out management port to control its fans. And I hope I'm wrong, but I think that project is dead. And the reason I say that is because I actually found a tool this past week which is actually able to manually control the fans for you, so you won't even need the IPMI. So I set all the fans to the lowest they can go, and I could definitely notice the fans dropping in speed and becoming quieter. But the problem was the overall volume of the Xserve was still really loud, which I realized was solely because of the power supply fans. And as far as I know, I don't believe there's any way to change the speed on those. Again, I could be wrong, and if I am, I'd be happy to be proven wrong on that. But as far as I know, I don't think there is. So unless you like hardware mod your power supplies or power supply, depending on if you have one or two for redundancy, unless you're going to mod that, remove the fans that are on there and put new quieter fans on there, yeah, I don't think it's going to work, which is really a shame. But I guess it is what it is. It was meant to be a server stuck in a closet or data center or something where no one would ever have to hear it, so it could be as loud as it wanted. But it was a good attempt. Which another thing, speaking on that, I did notice with the Xserve when I was playing around with it, my version, my configuration draws, I think, around 140 watts doing absolutely nothing. and sometimes it can get up to like closer to 200. And I guarantee you that's solely because of the fans. Like I guarantee if I was able to like control those fans to a more audible, friendly level, it'd probably be a lot less than that. But it just kind of also goes to show how old those processors are, because also for context, I have a Dell R620 that basically runs all of the virtualization for like all the VMs I do. Not all of them, but the vast majority of them. And that thing draws around 140 watts also. And that's actually doing stuff, not just sitting there. So yeah, they're a lot more, the newer processors are obviously a lot more power efficient. And because they're more power efficient, they don't produce as much heat, and therefore the fans don't have to spin as much, and just in general the fans don't spin as much, so that saves a lot of power. So yeah, rack mounted servers, their fans can actually use a ton of power, which is kind of funny and kind of mind blowing. But anyway, another thing that I did was I finally got around to managing my config files with Git. Now, this is a project I've been kind of wanting to do for a while. And if you have as many like different servers and computers as I do, having to remember which settings or configurations you changed and having to manually go through and do all that is just a royal pain. So if you can just, on one machine, you make a change, you commit the change, you push the change to your repository, and then on another machine that you need to pull down that configuration, you can just do like a git pull and it's all there ready to go. It is so nice. So if you're out there and you have like some configuration files, I highly recommend doing something similar to that so you can, more easily manage your config files. Now getting into the actual episode about Homelabs. So I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that we would be here for a very, very, very long time if we went down every single avenue for Homelabs. And the reason for that is because no Homelab is created equal. Nobody's Homelab is exactly the same, and that's for a couple reasons. One, it comes down to how much you're willing to spend, because at the end of the day, it's just a hobby, and you can spend as much as you want or as little as you want on your hobbies. If you have a ton of money to spend on your hobbies, maybe you buy the latest and greatest stuff and it's all new and fancy and shiny. Or maybe if you're, don't have a ton of money to spend on your hobbies, you kind of, scrap together, bits and pieces here and there and grab what you can, that kind of thing. And then the other thing why they differ is because everyone has different goals in mind. So one person, they might have like 10 different network switches because they want to learn networking and they're trying to get like some networking certificates, right? And whereas you might have someone else that has a bunch of, data, like a bunch of NAS servers with a bunch of hard drives because they're a data hoarder, as we like to call them. They just have a ton of data that they like to keep around. Or maybe they have like a ton of movies or TV shows that they like to store and stream from their their own private servers. Or maybe they have, a couple small, like a bunch of Raspberry Pis because they're doing like a bunch of like small, like little projects. Or maybe they have, or maybe they're doing like some kind of Kubernetes cluster on those Raspberry Pis. They're trying to learn that. Or maybe they have some rack-mounted servers and they have a cluster of hypervisors set up so they can have high availability. Or maybe they have a few old desktops lying around that they have Linux and Windows installed on so they can have like, development environments for their software testing. There's so many different possibilities for what you can do with your Homelab, and the kind of hardware that you could have just varies immensely. Like I'm not even going to attempt to give you a list of this is what you should have. You should buy these things XYZ, because like I've mentioned, it's going to vary depending on what you want. Like maybe you don't want, a rack mounted server because it's loud and you don't have a rack and you don't need that much power anyway, and you're just kind of getting your feet wet and you just kind of want to experiment. Or maybe you don't want a large 48 port switch because, again, it's loud and you don't need that many ports anyway, and all that stuff. So it really comes down to what you want to use it for. And that's why no one can really tell you, what you should have in your home lab or what you should do with your home lab, because at the end of the day, it's your hobby. You do what you want. But when you're trying to think about, if you're like just starting out and you're thinking, I kind of want to get into this home lab thing, what kind of hardware should I get? Well, again, it kind of comes down to what are your goals, right? Do you want to learn networking and set up different VLANs, virtual LANs, local area networks? Do you want to practice with virtualization? Do you want to learn Linux? Do you want to learn Windows system administration and Active Directory and all that fun stuff? It really depends on what you want to do. Do you want to self-host some services at your house, like Pi-hole or a VPN? It really depends on what you want to do. So I can't really come out and say, hey, you should buy X, Y, and Z. But what I can say is anyone that is a software developer should most definitely have a home lab for a few reasons. One, if you're in the tech industry like software developers are, you are well aware that technology is always changing and evolving. So if you have a home lab, and say you have, a hypervisor, for example, and you can spin up VMs or containers at will, when some new technology comes out, you can easily just quickly spin up a VM, throw that, whatever that new software or whatever that new technology or gadget or, whatever that thing is, you can, throw it in a VM, test it around, play around with it, kind of get to know it, that kind of thing. And then another thing that you can do as a software developer is ideally, I say this ideally, kind of, I guess you could say that's in quotes because it doesn't always happen, but in an ideal world, if you're a software developer, you're actively testing your code on different devices and more specifically different operating systems just to make sure that it runs as intended. That doesn't always happen, but that's, as they say, best practice. But another reason why it's helpful, if you're a software developer, to have a home lab, you can have multiple development environments. So you could have one for Linux, one for Windows, one for Mac OS. You could have one for multiple different types of Windows. If you're trying to build, different builds for different types of OSs. So if, say, you're trying to build an ARM version for Linux, you're trying to build an x86 version of Linux, you're trying to build a 64-bit version of Windows, somehow you manage to get yourself I'm not even going to go with Windows for ARM because that's a joke at this point still. I don't even know if Microsoft cares about Windows for ARM, but that's a whole different other discussion. But say for whatever reason you're trying to build a 32-bit Windows application because you want legacy stuff. You need some way to test that. So having a home lab would be a great way to do that because you can have the hardware to do that, or you can virtualize those environments to be able to do that. Virtualizing would probably be the easier option because you depending on how old of technology you'd be trying to go, like in this example, trying to build a 32-bit application, depending on how old you're trying to go, there becomes a tipping point with hardware where it gets so old that it becomes vintage and it starts going back up in value rather than continuing to go down. So when you're looking at prices for stuff, it'll, when it's brand new, it's obviously really expensive. And then it slowly starts to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And then say whatever manufacturer stops producing it or stops supporting it, then it gets even cheaper. It kind of falls off a cliff a little bit. And then it still gets cheaper, and then it kind of slowly levels out and kind of bottoms out. And then it reaches the vintage era, and then it starts going back up again. So depending on how old of stuff you're talking about, it'd probably be a lot easier and cheaper to virtualize it, which you could do with a Homelab. So that's kind of, some of the things you could think of if you're a software developer, why you would want to have one. Another reason you'd want to have one if you're a software developer, not only if you're trying to make cross-compiled applications, like if you're using a C or C++, but also just because you're using a language that theoretically works on different machines without issue, like Python, there are specific things that are OS specific. So there are certain ways of doing something on Mac OS and Linux that's different from doing it on Windows. And there's things that are slightly different on Linux than it is Mac OS. So that's something you'd want to test. And if you didn't test that, and you say you publish the software on your GitHub, and then someone says, hey, I got this error trying to run it on Linux, and you developed it on Windows. Well, if you don't have a Homelab with, a Linux environment to test your code on, you can't replicate their error that they're getting, and you can't patch it. Or it'd be a lot harder to patch their error, patch their bug, right, if you didn't have that environment. I mean, sure, you could try to guess and check and all that, but that's not very good. You want to have a specific environment where you can replicate the error at hand and then make a patch for it, and then make sure that didn't break anything else, and then you can push that patch. So that's another great reason why software developers should have a Homelab set up. So they can have a dedicated sandbox testing environment where they can run their code and try to break it or make sure that it's working as intended. They can replicate errors that people might be having, and it's just a fantastic way for software developers to go through that software development process. Because in industry, in the corporate world, when you do software development, you have your development servers, and then you have your production servers. And the whole point of the development servers is for you to run your code on, test your code on, that kind of thing. And if something breaks, it's okay because it's just development. And then you have your production, where once everything's proven to work, then you can push it to production. So having a Homelab is essentially like having that development environment that you would in industry, and that would kind of give you good practice for what it's like in the real world, being able to develop, push your code to a testing environment, do some testing, building there, checking for bugs, all that kind of stuff. And it would definitely be a great best practice for you to kind of get accustomed to what it's like once you're in industry, or just hone your skills in industry if you're already there, or if you're, say, still learning, if you're in school or whatever. It'd be a great way to, prepare yourself for industry, so you can kind of put that on a resume or in a job. If you're kind of going through a job interview, you can say yeah, I have a Homelab, I've done some software development in my free time, I have development environments that I push code to and do testing there just to make sure it works on different operating systems. And employers will definitely be impressed by that for sure. So you should definitely do that, that also brings up the point that if you're a software developer, you theoretically should be kind of making up your own personal projects and doing things like that, because that's, one, it helps hone your skills better, and two, it looks good for employers and all that. We did a whole episode about why the power of personal projects on the Dark Assassins podcast a while ago. So if you haven't listened to that, go and check that out, and we dive a lot deeper into why, if you're a software developer, you should be working on personal projects. But in addition to working on personal projects, you should be testing said personal projects in the various different environments you're planning on supporting your software in, especially if you're planning on writing any kind of cross-platform applications where you have to compile it on different operating systems, like if you're using, like I mentioned, a C++ or a C, or anything like that. So I guess now we'll kind of get into the fun part of talking about Homelabs, which is talking about hardware. Now, I've mentioned a couple of things about hardware, like how much does it cost to set up a Homelab? why 10 gigabit Ethernet is still expensive, and all that good stuff. But let's start with the basics. Now, I've talked a lot on this podcast about how I have rack-mounted servers and I have a dedicated server rack at my house. So I guess the question comes, should you, dear listener, fellow assassin, buy a rack-mounted server? And personally, I kind of got to say no, just because, like, so I guess the obviously the real reason I say no is because by telling you no and don't buy one, that means there'll be less people in the market buying them, which will decrease the prices, which also decreases the amount of people buying them, which means there's more for me to buy. I'm kidding, obviously, but realistically, I say no mainly because if you don't have a server rack and you buy a rack-mounted server, where are you gonna put it? I mean, I guess you could like lay it on a desk or whatever, but like they're kind of big, so they take up a good amount of space. And if you don't have like a dedicated place to put one, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. And if you don't already have a server rack, that's an additional cost that you have to factor into buying, a server. So when you could, if you don't have a server rack and you're planning on buying a rack-mounted server, say your rack-mounted server is, I don't know, $300, and then you're going to have to tack on at least another $150 to $200 minimum for a rack. And I mean, right there, you're like right around the $500 range. If you wanted to just make a system for $500, you'd getting a lot better deal. But anyway, but the other reason why I can't necessarily recommend them is because they may or may not sound like jet engines. As we've mentioned with the Xserve, it is quite loud. But the problem with the noise is it's really hard to know how loud it is until you get your hands on it. Because if you look on forums for people's opinions on how loud something is, people's opinions of loud are very different. Someone will say, oh yeah, that's not loud at all, and it's really loud because they're so used to the noise. And then there'll be other people that are so used to like whisper quiet, non-existent fan noise, and they'll be like, oh yeah, this thing's super loud, and to you it basically just kind of sounds like normal background noise, like it's not bad at all. So it's really hard to judge fan noise, and unless you have a dedicated place where you can put this rack-mounted server that you don't have to be in the same room as it, generally fan noise is an issue and a thing you have to be thinking about when you're buying hardware for your Homelab. Now, if you say have like a basement or something and like a separate closed off room in the basement, or you have like, a climate controlled shed or something in the backyard that you can put stuff in, or some dedicated space where sound is not an issue, then obviously it doesn't matter if the server's a screamer and a jet engine because you don't have to hear it. But I think a decent amount of people have like their server racks and their rack-mounted servers kind of in the same room as, say, their office or something. And in that case, you don't exactly want to have this jet engine roaring while you're trying to get work done. I mean, in fairness, a little bit of fan noise from a server could be nice if you like kind of like a white noise background kind of thing, but there's obviously a tipping point there where the noise is so loud and so obnoxious that it's distracting and annoying, and it kind of like hurts your brain after a while because it's so loud and high pitched. May or may not be speaking from personal experience on that one. But regardless, there's a lot of research that goes into rack-mounted servers. And in addition to them being loud, depending on the brands, kind of thinking about HP in particular on this one. Although they can be kind of picky on things that work for them, so there's a lot of research that you have to do if you're looking to get a rack-mounted server. So basically, what it boils down to is, unless you already have a rack or you are planning on getting a rack anyway, I definitely wouldn't recommend one. And another thing you also have to take into account if you're buying a rack-mounted server, and even if you have a rack, depending on the seller, you may or may not get rails included with that server, and that would be an additional expense you would have to add on top of the server. And rails for servers can range anywhere from like $50 to $60 up to like over $100. So if your server doesn't come with rails, you have to factor that in also. So there's a lot of things that you have to take into account if you want to get a rack-mounted server. And if you don't have a rack, don't even think about getting a rack-mounted server, because personally I don't think it's worth it. Some gear that I think the only thing that I can recommend that anyone interested in Homelabbing get is some kind of network switch. But even then, it depends on your goals, because if you're just starting out and you're only getting one device, just to kind of get your feet wet and play around with it, then you don't really need a switch. But if you're planning on, making this a hobby and, actually and building up your lab and getting more hardware and that kind of thing, those 4 ports on the back of your router, they're going to fill up pretty quick. So having a switch that you could, plug all your devices into would be nice and convenient. And you can buy switches that aren't rack mounted. You can buy just plain desktop switches, and those are a lot quieter. That's another thing with rack-mounted switches. They're kind of like rack-mounted servers. They're kind of hit or miss on whether they're jet engines or not. And I've even heard stories that the network switches basically make the servers sound like nothing with how loud they are. So that's also something to keep in mind if you're planning on getting a big honking switch with a ton of ports on it. That's like an old enterprise switch. You're going to want to watch out for that. Again, if fan noise could potentially be an issue for you. But when it comes down to buying a switch and a server rack for that matter, as far as how many ports you should get, or how many if you're talking about a rack, you should get, the general rule of thumb that people tell you to follow is figure out how many, so if we're talking about switches here, figure out how many Ethernet ports you need to take up, and then at minimum double it and get a switch that size. So let's say you have 6 Ethernet ports that you're going to use up. You obviously don't want to get an 8-port switch, because you'll probably have to upgrade that thing pretty quickly. So if you got yourself, say, like a 16 or a 24-port switch, then you're probably going to be set for quite a while and won't need to upgrade anytime soon, which is kind of the point. Because if you're always having to upgrade your switch every couple months because you ran out of space, it would be kind of annoying, and plus you're kind of wasting money at that point. Although I guess you could reuse the switch that you bought, but then that just takes up more space, especially if you have a rack. Rack space can be a premium depending on how big your rack is and how much stuff you have in the rack. So that might not even be an option, keeping an extra switch around in the rack, depending on how big your rack is. So, and then additionally, I guess going on to the rack, if you are planning on getting a server rack, the rule of thumb, figure out how many you're currently going to occupy, and then at minimum double it. So if, say, you're going to, because racks are not cheap. You're easily looking at like, depending on how big of a rack you want, you can, I'm not joking about this, you can find 42U racks that are cheaper than like the smaller 12 or 15U or 25U racks, which is kind of funny. But if you're, I mean, 12U and 15U racks, you're looking in like the 250 range generally. So if you say you bought like a 12U rack and you have 10U worth of gear, and then you have to and then you're like, oh, I'll just upgrade to a 15U now. Well, there you just spent like, close to over $400 on a rack when you could have easily just bought one bigger one and wouldn't have had to deal with that. So yeah, generally the rule of thumb, figure out how much space you need and then double it so you can be able to have room to grow into stuff, which I guess kind of when it comes down to, when we're talking about switches and especially server racks, it comes down to, it's kind of like the Costco mentality where if you buy in bulk, you save. The more ports you get, it's like cheaper per port sometimes. Although the bigger one it's cheaper per U. Like the bigger rack you get, the cheaper it is. And if you are thinking about getting a server rack, one thing I would recommend, if you or someone you know has the ability to like haul stuff, like say you have like a big SUV or a truck or something, I would honestly recommend like going on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace or eBay, like finding local listings that are for local pickup, because there are some like people out, like some enterprises out there that have like these super nice enclosed enterprise grade server racks that are like, can be full, that some of them are even like fully decked out with like power distribution units and fans and, you know, everything. They're super nice, that some places are either giving them away for dirt cheap or even free in some cases. So if you're able to, you know, find one of those deals, I would spring for it, because those are pretty nice. But otherwise, unless you're really planning on making this a hobby, I have to say I'd stay away from racks and rack mounted gear just because of how expensive they are. So if you're just getting into it, I would, you know, test the waters with it with like, you know, either an old desktop or an old laptop you got lying around. Or if you don't have one of those, buy like you can buy like, you know, old like business computers, like, you know, Dell Optiplexes or HP like Pro Desks or Elite Desks, or, you know, any kind of one of those like old business desktops that, you know, businesses are throwing away and like begging people to buy them. Like you can find those for well under $100 if you're looking. Like you can find them for pretty cheap. So if you don't have like an old desktop or an old laptop lying around and you want to get into this, that's kind of what my recommendation would be. And the other thing about it too is like if you count a Raspberry Pi as a desktop computer, half of the computers in my Homelab are actually old desktop computers. Like I like to talk about my rack mounted servers because they're cool, but they only make up about half of my Homelab. And one of them, well, actually, I guess technically two of them aren't even on the majority of the time. So really, out of my Homelab that's on pretty much all the time, the majority of them are like desktops, which kind of, you know, drives home the point that you don't need, you know, a ton of rack mounted gear to get into this. Like you can get into Homelabbing for pretty cheap. And the other nice thing about it is, depending on what you're trying to do, like if you're just trying to like, you know, self-host services like, you know, Pi-hole or a VPN, or maybe your own router with like pfSense or something like that, you don't need that powerful of hardware. So like, as a matter of fact, the most recent upgrade that I got was a desktop computer. It was an HP Elite Desk, I think it was. It has like a 4th gen i5 in it, and I bought a 2-port gigabit NIC network interface card for it to slap in there and make a router. And that thing all in, I think, was easily under $70. I think it was like 60 something maybe for the computer and the network card. And I was able to throw Proxmox on there as a hypervisor, so I could virtualize the pfSense router instance, and I could put a Pi-hole on there. And it works great. And the reason why I had to get the extra the network interface card was because obviously most desktop computers don't have multiple Ethernet ports on them, so that was the reason I had to get the card, was so I could have more Ethernet ports. But also the nice thing about that was I was pretty much able to give the pfSense router VM essentially 2 dedicated ports on it, so they're not sharing it with anything. So that's, I guess, kind of a nice thing. But this really just drives home the point that you can get away with some pretty cheap gear, and it'll work great for you. And like I've mentioned in other episodes, like if you get anything, like especially consumer grade between like that kind of 2010 era from like 2011, 2012 to like, 2016, 2017, when Intel was just kind of sitting around, not really doing much as far as like year-over-year upgrades. Like pretty much kind of anything in that range, like you'll be fine with. It'll serve you well, even though it is, getting to be 10 years old at this point, or closing in on 10 years old at this point. It's still like, some quality gear, which is nice because, all these enterprises that, had these business computers, they're just trying to throw them away. So you can generally score some gear for pretty cheap if you're trying to get into it. But yeah, like, again, when it comes down to it, before you buy anything, make sure you have a goal in mind. And it's okay if that goal changes. For me personally, like, when I first started out, I wanted to, kind of host some of my own things, like host my own Pi-holes and that kind of thing. And then as I started getting into it, I was like, maybe I'll add this technology. Maybe I'll add that. Maybe I'll throw this VM on there. Oh, now I want to play around with Docker containers. I can, do some of that. I want to have separate development environments for Windows and Linux. I can do that. As you kind of get into the hobby, it'll, your goals change. You'll find, a cool project idea that you want to, try out and test. You'll find a new piece of hardware that's really interesting to you and you want to play around with it. I mean, there's a lot of different things that you can do, as we've kind of been talking about this episode. So before you buy anything, kind of at least have a rough idea of what you want to do. Because if you have a rough idea of what you want to do, that'll better help you figure out what you should get to make that goal a reality. Because obviously, if you don't plan on doing any kind of like heavy virtualization, you really don't need, a rack-mounted server with 2, 16-core Xeons in it, for virtualization. You don't need that. Also, like if you're not planning on, storing a ton of data, you don't need to buy, a gigantic NAS with, 10 terabyte hard drives in it, right? Like, I mean, that's obviously overkill for you. So once you kind of figure out what you want to do and what you want to work on and what you want the focus of your lab to be, that can better help you, figure out where you want to go with this, what tools you want to install, what, services you want to install, that kind of a thing, what you want to play around with, all that good stuff. So that's my recommendation for you guys. If you want to get into this Homelab space, which I highly recommend you do, it's great for self-hosting things. It's a lot of fun to play around with this stuff. But the thing that you got to keep in mind is it is your home lab after all. So you can do what you want in it. You can play around with whatever gear you want, but just figure out what you want to do with it, and that'll help you figure out where to go from there. And the thing with it is, if you ask someone, hey, I want to do, start my first home lab, what gear should I get? The first question that basically anyone is going to tell you is, what do you want your home lab to be? Because if you don't know what you want your home lab to be, it's going to be really hard to give you hardware recommendations on, what you should be picking up. So figure out what you want it to be, and then you can go from there, kind of looking, do some searching online, of possible things. Or heck, you can even reach out to me if you want, shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com and say what your goals are, and maybe I can give you some hardware recommendations. But first off, figure out what you want to do. And then honestly, if you have any kind of old, desktops or laptops lying around, personally, I'd start with that because it's free. You don't have to pay any money, which we love that. So yeah, I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode. If you enjoyed it, I ask that you leave a rating and review and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member, so we can, grow this community here, the Dark Assassins podcast, and get more home labs out there. It's a very underrated hobby. If you have any questions about this episode or any topics you want me to cover in a future episode, send me a question at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or you can click the link in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.